Okay. All right. So welcome to our final uncomfortable conversation of the season. This is a series that we started in July, and we're just trying to bring together our community to have conversations about justice-related issues that we maybe avoid, maybe we don't know enough about to think we can have these conversations, but that we think are really important. And so at the Boston Faith and Justice Network, one of our missions is to bring Christians together. So around issues of justice and generosity. And so during the pandemic, we had to do a lot of rethinking and how can we bring Christians together because we're not allowed to be together. And the beauty of technology is that we can still be together in this way. And so these panels have been a wonderful opportunity to bring people like this beautiful panel surrounding me now together to talk about the things that they do, their work, their passion, their expertise, and allow us to sort of sit in and hear what's going on. What can we do? How can we learn about this issue? And then how can we engage and be doers of justice and lovers of mercy out in the world? So I'm gonna try to talk as little as possible and let these amazing people speak and share. So right now I'm actually gonna just invite them to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about the work they do. And then we're gonna dive into some questions. So why don't we start with Jill?
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Wong. I am an immigration attorney at Catholic Charities. We are down in South Boston. Been there for about 12 years. And I do direct legal representation for clients. So basically, family-based and humanitarian-based immigration cases are the cases that I focus on when, family members, or if someone is a victim of a crime, abuse, trafficking, things like that, are the client base for us.
Great, thank you. Next, I'll invite Jean-Baptiste. Can you introduce yourself to us?
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jean-Baptiste Ntagengwa. I'm a priest, ordained priest in the Episcopal Church, currently serving as a canon for immigration and multicultural ministries in the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts, downtown Boston.
Thank you. Matt?
And my name is Matt Sorens. I work at World Relief. I'm the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization and Advocacy. And I'm based actually out of Aurora, Illinois. So I'm not actually in Boston, although we have my colleague Patty, who's in the Boston area, on as well. Yeah, my job is basically to help church partners and denominational partners all around the country to think about issues of immigration from a biblical perspective, and then apply that both in terms of ministry as well as advocacy.
Great. And Emily?
Hi, good evening. My name is Emily Lung. I'm the supervising immigration attorney at the Justice Center of Southeast Massachusetts. We're a regional legal services office with 4 offices throughout Southeast Massachusetts, Cape and Islands. And in my role as a supervising attorney, I help manage other attorneys and advocates who do direct representation on a wide range of cases, primarily focusing on humanitarian-based immigration and family, but I also engage in a fair amount of advocacy work in my role as well.
Thank you. And Patty, introduce yourself as well.
Sure. My name is Patty McDonald. I am the Northeast Director for Strategic Partnerships for World Relief, but I am local to the Boston area, and my job really is to work in putting meaningful partnerships together with churches and individuals and foundations, and connect them to the work that World Relief is doing, and really through the church, actually. So we work globally and as well as in the US. So just thought it was important. Matt's a little bit more of the expert, but I am the local face of World Relief. So.
Great, thank you. We're so grateful to have you here and to have all of you here. I think if you're joining us, you can see why I'm so excited about this panel, because these people just are obviously doing some really interesting and important work. And for me, which I didn't introduce myself, I realized my name is Elizabeth. I run the Boston Faith and Justice Network, but I, in another life, was an immigration attorney, and one of the people on this panel used to be my partner. And so this is something that I'm just sort of excited to bring that life into this life and listen to these people I have no expertise to offer, but just a passion for this subject matter. And I'm so excited to just be able to listen and learn from the people that we have here. So thank you all for giving of your time, which I know is probably our most precious resource. So I'm really grateful to have you all here. So we're going to start with some questions. And Matt, you are up first. And I'm going to ask you to help us define some terms because immigration is such a complicated area. Sometimes it just helps to get started on the ground floor. So can you explain the difference between a refugee, an immigrant, asylum seekers, and someone who's undocumented?
Sure. So, I mean, big picture, an immigrant is basically someone from one country residing in another country. So that's sort of the umbrella term. Refugees are, I guess I would say, a subset of immigrants. They are defined under both US and international law as individuals who have fled their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. So that's at least our US legal definition, and also many other countries use the same definition. It's worth noting there's lots of other vulnerable immigrants who have fled something that may not fit into that kind of categorization. The asylum seeker is another term I'd probably mention because this is in the news a lot. An asylum seeker is basically someone who professes to meet the definition of a refugee. But the distinction is where that determination is made. So for a US refugee resettlement, someone is determined to be a refugee in a different country, and then a small share of the world's refugees get invited to come to the United States and be resettled. An asylum seeker is someone who isn't necessarily invited, but either shows up on a temporary visa or shows up at the border and basically says, please don't send me back because I have a credible fear of persecution for one of these reasons. And then undocumented is someone who is in the country without valid legal status. So the best estimates is that somewhere around 11 million people, roughly a quarter of the immigrant population in the United States overall, split roughly half between people who came in without lawful entry, so they got over the border without being apprehended, but then the other half came in with a valid visa, often like a tourist visa or a student visa, and then they just didn't go back when they should have under the terms of their visa. It's also worth noting that that's a really diverse group of people. The population that comes across the border is majority Mexican, although not entirely, and recently it's more Central American. But those who come in on temporary visas are from every part of the world. So it's a diverse population.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And as we're addressing an audience that, though ecumenical, is primarily coming from a Christian background, what are some biblical principles that we can apply that can guide us in how we should think about the issue of immigration?
Yeah, there are very, very many. In fact, the Hebrew word for an immigrant, the word ger, which appears in the Old Testament 92 times. So I won't go through each of those 92 instances, but there's a lot in the Old Testament in particular, as well as in the New Testament, that speaks to how we should think about immigrants and issues of immigration. Just a few big picture things I know. Immigrants are very often mentioned, and it's immigrants or foreigners, aliens, strangers, depending upon your English translation of the Bible, but they're mentioned often alongside orphans and widows as uniquely vulnerable groups of people whom God makes very clear he loves, and then whom he commands his people to love as well. And often that's mentioned alongside the reminder to the people of Israel that they were foreigners in the land of Egypt, which I think for Americans, who in most cases can trace our roots to somewhere else, should resonate as well. That God basically tells the Israelites, look, when you're established in a new place and you're doing well, you need to remember that it was my grace that brought you out of that place of desperation and oppression in Egypt to where you are now, so that when people come into your land, you treat them better than Pharaoh treated you. And maybe I would lastly say just the other overarching biblical issue here is the command to love our neighbors. And we find that in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 19. A few verses later in Leviticus 19:33 and 34, it says, when a foreigner resides within you in your land, you shall not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you shall be to you as your native born. You shall love them as yourself. And then, of course, Jesus speaks to that in Luke chapter 10 and elsewhere in the Gospels when he's asked what's the greatest commandment. And his response is the story of the Good Samaritan, which I think it's fair to conclude from that story that the neighbor whom we're called to love can't be narrowly defined as someone who shares our ethnicity or our religion or who happens to live 2 doors down from us, but could be just about anyone who's in need.
Great, thank you. And finally, for our time with you, what are some common misconceptions that get in the way for people, including Christians, from engaging in these conversations? Like, what have you found that stops people from entering into this?
Yeah, there are many, unfortunately. This is an issue that, is rife with misinformation, especially if your primary source of information is Facebook, which is, I know, the medium that we're on right now, but or, social media. There's lots of inaccurate information floating around, and some of it kind of scary. So I think one dynamic is around economics. And again, from one perspective, from a Christian perspective, I think our call is to love our neighbors, whether or not that makes us more affluent. But the irony is, if you talk to almost any economist, they would almost all agree that on the net, immigration has a net positive economic impact on the United States. That's not to say there are not costs, and it's fair to count those costs, but economists don't do cost analyses. They do cost benefit analyses. And when they do so, they quite consistently find that the contributions that immigrants make, and this is true whether you're looking at refugees specifically, or you're looking at undocumented immigrants specifically, or just immigrants as a whole, outweigh the costs that they bring with them. I'd say another misconception is around security and safety. And again, if you go back to that Good Samaritan story, the Samaritan in that story, the hero in our model of neighborly love, actually was not thinking primarily about his own safety, or he probably wouldn't stop by the side of a dangerous road to help someone who is in need. But the reality is that welcoming immigrants in the United States or refugees is very safe. Like refugees in particular, who often get, I think, inexplicably associated with terrorism, they go through the most thorough vetting process of any category of visitor or immigrant who's coming into the United States. It's actually a remarkably effective vetting process. Since 1980, when the Refugee Act was signed into law by President Carter, there's been 3 million refugees resettled to the United States, and not a single one of them has taken the life of an American citizen in a terrorist attack who's come through that resettlement program. So that's a remarkable record. It's not to say that we can't always be improving it, or that we shouldn't affirm our government's role in ensuring security. But I think, I always want to bring us back to make sure that the church is doing our role, which is to ask who is our neighbor, and to be the people there at the airport to welcome people and to help them integrate into a new community. We could go into others because there's many, but I'll maybe leave it at that just to let other people have a chance to share.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. I think that brought up a lot of important points I think we might end up coming back to a little bit later, but thank you for that. Okay, Emily, you're up next. And can you tell us just a little generally about the work that you do, and kind of how that just speak, because you touch on so many different things in your work. And so can you kind of paint us a picture of the work that you do at the Justice Center?
I will try my best, but we will see how that goes. So I know, because Jill is also a colleague in the field, that, she will speak to more of that direct client work. And so I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly, even though my organization and I am involved in direct work, a little bit about the other kind of immigration work that goes on that's really more policy based. And so a lot of the work that I do right now is working on local, state, and federal levels to look at areas in which we can improve the lives of immigrants. Some of those things are very much in the news now, like the Biden proposals for the Citizenship Act to provide a pathway to citizenship to many individuals who are in the United States now in undocumented, or maybe I would call an underdocumented status, which might be a status that doesn't lead to any sort of permanency in the United States. And so, there's work to be done at each of those levels. And sometimes that work is proactive, which is a stage that we're in right now. And it's really great to be in a more proactive phase of immigration work. But, just reflecting very recently, a lot of that work was also defensive in terms of fighting back and pushing against policies and things that were happening on state, local, or federal levels where we could do those things. So kind of to give more color and context to what I mean, because that is pretty amorphous sounding, are some, examples. So on a very local level, for example, I've been involved in various things around what we call like trust acts or welcoming ordinances. There's a lot of different localities who've used different names for them, but this kind of goes to the heart of, like, in a local setting, like in my town where I live, do I want my local government to engage in any way in federal immigration enforcement? Do I want them to utilize any of our town resources to do those things? Or do we want to be a welcoming community in which we focus our local resources on local issues and we let the federal government do what the federal government does? I think sometimes there's a lot of misconception around that type of work. that kind of work has often also been called like sanctuary cities, and sanctuary has a very specific meaning within this context of this group and audience, but sanctuary has become unfortunately somewhat of a dirty word in the immigration context, where it's being utilized to say that this is harboring individuals who are violent and otherwise bad elements in our communities, where that's really not true. It's not reflected. I mean, Matt spoke to it, and there's been lots of studies about criminality as well among immigrant populations, which has shown there's lower rates of criminality among all types of immigrant populations. So that's an example on a local level of a type of work that can be done. And on a state level, there's actually many kinds of decisions that are in the hands of states to make. And if you are someone who had the privilege of being born with citizenship, it's very likely that you never considered the ways in which your citizenship affords you rights that are assumed because you're a citizen. I think many people think like, oh, as a citizen, you get to vote, because that's what we talk about a lot. And the voting is extremely important, and citizens should take that duty seriously. But if you are not a citizen, there are many other ways in which your immigration status touches your life that you may not have thought about in the past. So your right to work in the United States is tied to your immigration status. Your right to have a driver's license in Massachusetts is tied to your immigration status. Your ability to qualify for in-state tuition in Massachusetts is tied to your immigration status. Your ability to access state and federal benefits is tied to your immigration status. And if you were born a citizen, I was not, but if you were born a citizen, it might not occur to you that those things in your life, all these different intersecting parts of your life, you are actually using your privilege of citizenship to access those things, because that is the way that you were lucky enough to be born into the world. So you didn't have to know those things. But so on a state level, some of those decisions are fully within our hands. There are many Massachusetts high school students that graduate and qualify, for example, for the Adams scholarships, and they cannot utilize those scholarships to go to state institutions in Massachusetts, even though as a state, we could make a decision that they could utilize their scholarships and that they could qualify for in-state tuition. Other states have done similar efforts like that. So that's an example of something within the state that we can do. And driver's license is another one. As a state, we can decide that we will license every Massachusetts resident, regardless of their immigration status. The question of a real ID or what's called a federally compliant license is a different question. A federally compliant license has a whole host of things that need to be met for qualifications, including immigration status. But on a state level, we can still issue a Massachusetts license that would allow individuals who live in Massachusetts to get licenses. I think this isn't something that a lot of people think about or consider unless they themselves have been in that situation or have worked with others who've been in that situation themselves. And so those are a couple of examples of what this type of advocacy work can look like.
That's great. Sorry, I was cutting and pasting the bills that you had sent us to post those so that people can see those, because that's great information, and thank you for that. I just love the way that you explained that these are things that we don't think about, and it just makes me think of conversations I have around privilege and entitlement with my kids, which they love, by the way. Of course they do. So another thing that you and I talked about that, again, just the way you explained it was so great, and I would love for you to share it here, is because you work so much with immigrant communities. Can you help explain to us, and you touched on it in this, obviously, because that was inevitable, but like how much immigration touches on people's lives and the difficulty or navigating through the immigration system, what that is like. And I don't know if you would need to do that through examples or whatever, but how much that, what that looks like for people, because I think sometimes those of us who aren't daily involved, as many of you are, take for granted that it's a system, it's a government system, and it is what it is. And it's probably fine and easy.
If only that were the case. Yeah, unfortunately, the immigration system is quite a labyrinth. I don't know what is more complex than a labyrinth. It is that, and it also is a system that is really not geared to the audience that it is meant to interact with. The immigration system, you have to go into that system having usually computer literacy, English literacy, the ability to access complex systems, navigate legal process. But I think, you know, even for folks that understand that their immigration status is impacting their lives in terms of not being able to get a driver's license or get a job or get a good paying job or attend college, I think for them, they don't always come to us with an understanding of what that means. So very frequently we'll have someone come to our office seeking services. And what they say to us is, I really need to get a work authorization card. I really need to get a social security number, because they've been told over and over by every employer that they've gone to that they need to get a social security number. And so what they know is that they need to get a social security number. And we have to translate that into, okay, unfortunately, social security numbers don't grow on trees. And we have to find an immigration pathway for you that might entitle you to a social security number. And we're not able to just call Social Security and sort of get a social security number for you. And so that's like a very small example of how like we're trying to meet with people and understand their needs, but while they're feeling the impacts of how I'm not able to do certain things, I think there's really no way for most people to be able to understand like, but what are the options? What are my pathways that exist? In immigration, like I sort of, many people, not just me, I did not invent this in any way. There are sort of three main buckets in terms of what is a pathway in immigration. One is employment-based. I work with low-income individuals, so I don't do any employment-based immigration work, but employment-based visas are an option for some individuals, usually in high-earning fields. Then you have family-based petitions, and family-based petitions are when you are a foreign national or you're a US citizen and you marry or have children and you want to bring other family members over. There are very specific pathways that exist for family petitions. And then the other bucket, I think Jill and I probably both reference as humanitarian, it sort of breaks down to something bad happened to you, and there could be a pathway here based on that. That's the most basic way that I can explain like that giant bucket of things. Maybe you were a victim of a crime. Maybe you were a victim of trafficking. Perhaps you're a youth who's been abused or neglected, or a refugee. A refugee comes with status, but you're an asylum seeker because you were persecuted or you fear persecution. And so that's sort of the humanitarian bucket for me is like, unfortunately, it's the bad things happen bucket, but those are the pathways. Those pathways are not always even available to everyone. So even if you have the proper family relationship, there may be other barriers within immigration law that prevent you from being able to access that possible status. That really would be life-changing because it does touch on everything in your life. And so I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but you know, that's what I see as the interplay. And, you know, I think advocates, which don't always have to be attorneys, but, you know, very knowledgeable advocates and attorneys are needed to guide people through a system. I also just want to very quickly dispel this kind of a very commonly held idea about getting in lines and where are these lines going and why are people not doing things the right way. Maybe this is slightly outside of what you were hoping I would discuss, but there are not lines. There's not, you know, the whole right way concept or my ancestors came the right way. The laws were completely different at that time. There was a very, very long time in this country when the rule was come to the United States, don't have tuberculosis, and you can resettle in the United States with the full rights of a citizen of the United States. And so, yeah, it's great that your family came at the time that the rule was essentially don't have tuberculosis or have your tuberculosis resolve, and then we will allow you to enter the country. So, you know, that was the system for hundreds of years. And then sort of in the 1900s is when immigration really started moving and changing in a very different direction, especially in the mid 1900s and the the 1990s were also a very terrible time when a lot of very restrictive immigration laws were created. And then, you know, I just think it's important to kind of put that out there because in addition to the system itself being complex, there are many, many people we encounter who would love nothing more than to have legal status. But there are in some cases just not options available to them because of the way our system is designed.
That was so helpful. Thank you. You made us understand a complex system better by navigating us through a lot of the complexities. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you calling attention to this the right way question, which isn't something that we touched on, but is so important. And so I do feel like that's wonderful that you brought that up. I don't even practice immigration law anymore. And I probably at least once a month have a conversation with someone either wanting to gain status, or someone who is an expert in immigration because they watch the news. And it's like, I have to explain, there is no way, there are no ways. There has not been meaningful immigration reform since like 1999. And so, yeah, it's just a frustrating thing. And so the legalities of the system, but then the substance of the system. So thank you for pointing out those two levels at which sort of there's need for reform. Thank you very much. Okay, Jill, let's talk. Emily sort of touched on this humanitarian bucket, and I appreciated that way that she approached it. Something bad has happened, and so sometimes that means that there's a pathway in order to at least come to the United States for a little bit. And you and I had talked about a specific category in that I think sometimes people, again, there's misunderstandings around it, but also a lot of curiosity and wanting to understand and maybe engage when it comes to unaccompanied minors, because obviously there's been a lot of news around that. And I think because of that, sometimes, and Matt alluded to it, we're getting our news on social media or from less reputable outlets. So could you walk us through what happens when an unaccompanied minor comes to the United States?
Yes. So when I have been reading the news recently, and it talks about like this flood of unaccompanied minors, in my head, I'm thinking a sea of people. They're all faceless, just sea of people. So I thought I would start by just sharing a few of my client stories, just to put a face on some of that mass in our heads. So let's call this client V. He is 14. He comes into my office. He is from Guatemala. And the first thing I notice about him is that he is missing 2 of his fingers on his left hand. And so we sit down and we start talking about his story and whether or not he might qualify for some sort of relief. So then he starts sharing about how at 10 years old, he gets pulled out of school by his dad and made to work in a potato field. And he needs to then, he has a quota of how many bushels of potatoes he needs to pick a day, harvest. If he does not meet that quota, he gets a beating at night. And so the reason why his dad needs to do that is because they need the money, right? So we need the money, you have to pick 10 bushels of potatoes. If not, you get the beating. So he, at that point, he's like 10, 11, 12. He has a little knife and he's cutting out potatoes and he's trying to go fast. And so he cuts off 2 fingers. He and his brother at some point felt like this was too much. And so they, with some help from family, friends, escaped that situation. And when they talk about it, they say, we were okay with the picking potatoes. We understood that was something we needed to do to survive. But the beatings at night was what tipped them over. So that's story number 1. They got help from some friends, hired someone to take them over to the US and ended up in my office. Story number 2, we'll call her R. She came to me when she was 6. 6-year-old girl from El Salvador, and her father left the family before she was even born, so never knew her dad. Her mom pretty early on got involved with a boyfriend that was not very healthy or good for her. So she ended up living with grandma. Grandma had to work to support her, so she was only 4 when she was in El Salvador, bounced around the neighborhood, different people in the neighborhood, and sometimes at home on her own, just milling around. And one day her cousin comes, her teenage male cousin, and molests her. This comes out later on when she has an aunt in the US. The aunt goes back to visit and she tells her aunt this. She's like 5 years old and she tells it in the language that she can. And her aunt realizes what happens. her aunt comes back to the US and is horrified and figures out a way to bring her over to the US to get her out of that situation. So when her aunt is sharing the story, she's like sobbing. She's like, how did we allow this girl to go through this? When she comes to my office, she's 6, and we start the process for her then. And then the last one, we'll call him E. He's 16 years old when he gets to me. His father died when he was young, but he lived with his mom, decent life. His mom was providing pretty well for him. One day after school, he's playing soccer with another team they don't really know, but they just met out on the field. On the other team, there is a gang member, part of the MS gangs. And they play, he scores a goal, their team wins, the opposing team loses, that gang member is mad. And because of that, he's targeted, right? He's, for no reason, he's now a target of this gang. They follow him around, they swear at him, then they start making threats. And then one night they go and shoot at his house. And at that point, his uncle, his mother's brother, said, this is not okay for you or for us. They send him over to some relative's home. They can't really keep him. And so then they arrange for someone to bring him to the US. These are kind of just standard stories, but they are kind of faces of these children. They are not, they're not kind of in stable, happy families waiting to come to the US to, find some opportunity. These kids are really just fleeing from fear, from harm, from abuse. And they make their way to the border through buses, trucks, vans. They're in like the back of vans for days. Sometimes trains, they walk. There's not always bathrooms. There's not always shelter. But the ones that are lucky make it to the border. So now they're at the border. Generally, they get apprehended at the border. They are kept for a few days in detention, and then they're released to a shelter. Once at the shelter, they try to contact the people they know in the US, and that's how they could get connected with family members or family friends or whoever they know in the US. If they happen to not know anyone, they get put into the foster care system. So once they're connected to a family member, so for these clients, they have an aunt or an uncle or somebody in Boston. This family member then flies them out or some other way or by train. They are also put into court. So they start a court process for them. And now they are in Boston. For those that are lucky enough to have aunts and uncles and family friends who can find an attorney for them, and it is work to find an attorney, they then end up in our office or some attorney's office. For these children in particular, who have been abused, abandoned, and neglected, that is the criteria, and that it's in their best interest to stay. That means they have some sort of stability here, some home, some schooling, some medical care, and not in their best interest to go back. There is a immigration relief called Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. And that is what, as attorneys, we help them apply for. I won't take you through the process. It goes through multiple courts. And then we go into immigration court to try to get their green card at the end of the day if everything goes smoothly. But it does involve going to family court, going into immigration court. But at the end of the day, if everything goes well, they satisfy all the elements that there was abuse, abandonment, neglect by a parent, and it's in their best interest to stay and not go back, they are given a green card. And at that point, what Emily was saying, the financial aid, the benefits that come with the green card, some of them are just, in limbo until they have that. So that's kind of the journey. The process itself often takes 4 to 5 years if everything goes smoothly for them to get that green card. So a lot of these kids, they come at like 12, 13, 14. They're kind of like racing against the clock to see if they can get further education after high school because they need that green card to do that. So that's kind of a bird's eye view of some of the issues that the children face.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate you giving us stories, because like you said, sometimes it can feel like this faceless crowd, but it's not. It's individual human beings with stories and families. And yeah, so thank you for that. One other question for you. When we spoke, we talked about some issues that have come up in the last few years that highlight some systemic problems that can manifest in immigration. The laws and the policies, and some of the things that didn't ultimately happen within the immigration system that were being talked about. But again, they highlighted some of those systemic issues. So can you talk about the fee increase and or the public charge rule, the stuff that went on last year? Because I think it gives sort of a snapshot again, some of the stuff like we talked about with Emily, like there's so many obstacles and hurdles within this system. And so maybe just to like give people a little view of like, here's some other things to maybe think about what's going on within the system.
Yeah, I'll focus on the public charge rule. So, like Matt was saying, immigrants are often one of the most vulnerable groups because they often don't have the language. And then they often don't have financial stability, at least the groups of immigrants I see. And they're coming sometimes from trauma, and they don't have the ability to advocate for themselves. So the public charge rule happened back in February 2020. It basically was a rule that tried to prevent new immigrants applying for green cards to become public charges, meaning they would use government money, government benefits. And so how they screened for that was they came up with a big long form, and they had to provide a lot of documentation. And the form was a balance of positive and negative factors for whether or not they would become a public charge. And if the negative factors won out, then they would be denied their green card, right? So if you have too many negative factors that say you might become a public charge, you might use government funds, then no green card, you can't stay. So some of these factors, one was age. If you're between 18 and 61, that's a positive factor. But if you're over 61, that's a negative factor, right? So there's lots of US citizens with parents in other countries. The parents are getting older. Now they want their parents to come and, be with them, help support their parents. All of a sudden, these parents have this big negative factor because they're over 61. Another factor is health. So if you generally have a clean slate at the doctor's office, positive factor. If you have some disability, if you have some underlying health condition, it becomes a negative factor. Education, if you're well educated, positive factor. If you don't have a lot of education, negative factor. The list goes on. Skills, job experience, household income. But this all passed in February, and as attorneys, we were scrambling to get our clients to get, one, their heads wrapped around all these factors, and two, get documentation for all these factors. And then in November 2nd of last year, a district court, trial level court, put a stay or vacated it, meaning this rule is not going forward. So as attorneys, we're like, oh, clients, you guys don't have to do anything now. We don't need all that documentation. 3 weeks later, it goes up to appeal, and the appellate court decides, while we're deciding this, we're going to let the rule go forward. And so then we're calling the clients. We're like, nope, keep collecting those things. And I mentioned this court piece because the courts basically, the reason why it was in court was there was an administrative reason, right? Was the rule arbitrary and capricious? But there was also an equal protection reason. Are these rules equitable? Does it discriminate against people with disabilities? Does it discriminate against people who are older? And is that constitutional? And so, we see a lot of, I mentioned that immigrants are very vulnerable, and I think that the immigration policy works both ways. It can play into those vulnerabilities, and they can often be treated unequitably unless there are advocates that come up and fight these cases. And so at the end of the day, what ended up happening is the rule was vacated. So basically, the Biden administration, after they came in, they decided we don't want to pursue the appeal. So the whole appeal process dropped, and the last thing that happened was that district court vacated the rule. And so now we are free of that rule. But it does show, you know, in third grade when we learned like balance of powers and all of that, it does show that playing out in the immigration context and how vulnerable it is really for these immigrants.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think you did a great job of demonstrating that and showing us that back and forth and how difficult it is as advocates, but also when, you know, your whole ability to stay and be with family and do a job, whatever, is resting on this back and forth and some of these laws that can go in and out of effect, how vulnerable that must feel and how difficult that is. So thank you for sharing that. Jean-Baptiste, we're going to go with you next. Will you share with us a little bit about your journey here into the United States?
Sure, thank you for asking. Like I said, no, I didn't say it yet. I was born and grew up in Rwanda. And I'm sure most of you or all of you know what happened in Rwanda back in 1994. So in 1994, April, there was a genocide. Luckily, in January, my wife and I were able to escape that genocide. We left Rwanda, we were headed to Kenya to take a course in English. So the plan was to go back to Rwanda in April the 10th. And on the 6th, that's when the presidential aircraft was shot, and that triggered the genocide. So we were not able to go back to Rwanda. Members of our families were killed. And then rather than going to Rwanda, we went to Zaire, because at that time, we were supposed to be there for 3 months. Our provisions were for 3 months. Then we had to leave so that we can be able to survive. And the bishop then who had sent us to Kenya said, probably if we came closer to where we are in Zaire, we would be able to take care of you rather than you continue to be in Kenya. It's a little bit far from Rwanda. So when we went to Zaire, at that time, for a year, I was a coordinator of a small refugee camp of few members who were vulnerable, meaning some of them were intermarriage relationship. And when I say intermarriage, I'm sure you don't want to think it's white and black. It was because in Rwanda we have 3 ethnic groups, but 2 have been at loggerhead all the time, Hutu and Tutsi. So if a Hutu and a Tutsi are married, that's intermarriage. And so then those individuals were not welcomed anywhere in larger refugee camp. Whether you are a Hutu or Tutsi, you were not welcomed in that. You'd be seen as maybe a traitor or something. So a number of people who were from our diocese were kept there, and other people maybe who were injured or something. So it was a small refugee camp. I was coordinating, being kind of a liaison between the camp and military administration in Zaire and religious administration. So my wife and I stayed there for a year. We got our firstborn there in August 1994. And then when it was clear that something might happen, because we could see across the lake, we could see that there might be some war from Rwanda attacking these refugee camps. One could see it. So we decided to close that small camp to ask people, so now we can protect you, looking what's happening. So we're going to give you something that we have, then see where you can go. If you want to go back to Rwanda, if you want to go further and to stay here, whatever you decide to go, so do it. So for my family, my wife, my son and I, so went back to Kenya. Stayed there, took some courses. I went to Adventist school there, and my wife did too. And until 1998, that's when I graduated. And then 99 September, I came here to the US, and I was coming to do my master's degree at Harvard. But at the same time, I knew that now I'm far away from where there is conflict, which is still there even now, as we speak. So my intention and my hope was, now that I'm there, where it's free, where there's law, where I will apply for asylum, as Matthew spoke about asylum seeker. As soon as I landed here, and I had left my family in Kenya, even though I was coming to school, but my priority was to bring my family, to have them join me and see how it can be beyond being a student, change status. So eventually that happened. My family came after 5 months, they joined me. And then we started applying for asylum. And because I thank God that I had attorneys here describing, I did not know what that means. So I only look at the website, I found a form, I filled out myself. When I filled out that form myself, I sent it, and it did not take long. They told me they sent me intent to deny. Then I panicked. Say, what do I do now? Then after that, I spoke to a friend. Then that friend connected me to Catholic Charities. And the Catholic Charities assigned me a pro bono attorney, but it was too late. What I have said during interview and everything, and now as I was talking to this attorney, there's more detail. There's some detail they now put in the form. Eventually, they ultimately denied my application because there was some contradiction. There were some not consistent of dates and everything. So many things. So they denied my application. At that point, somebody asked me, how come that you knowing what happened in Rwanda, knowing Rwanda, how did they deny that application? Attorneys would answer that question very, very well. Since I did not know what I was doing, even though I have really credible fear, and I was even persecuted when I went back to Rwanda to change to have a new passport, but because of lack of knowledge. And here I want to pause and thank those organizations, Catholic Charities and World Relief and others that are helping, have pro bono attorneys to help asylum seekers. It's really appreciated. And I want, on behalf of all those individuals, I want to thank you for that. So when that was denied, luckily my attorney now advised me, said, well, since they said there's no appeal against that decision. That was shocking. I told him, what does this mean? He said, well, I don't know, but we'll see. So next step was, because I was a priest and serving in a church, and there was the law was a little bit open back then in 2000. So I was able, the attorney was able to help me to, and the church to petition special religious migrant visa. Then that was approved. When it was approved, I applied for a green card, and then eventually, after 5 years, I became a citizen. It's a long process. It's good, but eventually I am here. That's my journey in a nutshell.
Oh my goodness, thank you for being willing to share that with us. And it does so illustrate some of the stuff that we've been talking about. But it's your story. So thank you for sharing that with us. And now will you tell us a little bit about the work that you do with the Episcopal Church? I'd love to hear about that.
Thank you. In 2016, our diocese, Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts had two dioceses in the Episcopal Church, Western and Eastern, but Eastern is called the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. So we wrote a new mission strategy in 2016. And part of that mission strategy, it kind of committed to diocese to invest in immigrant and minority and communities of color. And to do that, the diocese decided to create a position of canon for immigration and multicultural ministries. And they asked me to head take that position. Our diocese, most of you are here in Boston, except Matthew. Boston has many immigrants, that from different countries, and some documented, others undocumented, and some of those are members of our church. And now, because I'm now in this position, my first thought was, so what am I going to do with these individuals, mostly who might be undocumented or documented or in the process, and maybe don't know even what to do next, like I was before when I came. So my first thing, as this conversation was going on, I took some courses in immigration law with World Relief. And after I have taken those courses, I tried to shadow with some organizations here and there and then to petition or to apply for the Department of Justice to be recognized and accredited to be able to do some basic legal services, to give legal services to our people, to our members. So then, as I was taking the courses, as I was going through that, I also started organizing some advocacy sessions, teaching, especially some education workshops for people to know their rights. Even though I wasn't giving those courses, I would invite attorneys to come and help me to educate our people, to educate immigrants, but at the same time, non-immigrants who might think they know or don't know anything, don't know that even immigrants have some rights. But so that one of the activities I started doing, education, when we were able to meet in person. When now this pandemic came, we started doing this on Zoom. So we do that at least once a month. We meet to do education in members of our church. The Episcopal Church has a branch called Episcopal Migration Ministry. You can see the poster here behind me. They do resettlement of refugees, and they have some resources. If I need somebody to come and teach it, or I talk to them. They have somebody. We'll also do advocacy in those gatherings. The way we do it, Episcopal Church has also Office of Government Relations. That office is in Washington, D.C. So I worked with that office to organize some trips to D.C. to do advocacy, to meet with our elected representatives. We also, if there is any letter writing or anything, they have more knowledge that they send to us, and then we organize that. And also now that that application has been approved, I might be able to start maybe giving some, at least sitting with somebody who doesn't know what to do, where to head, what is their options, or if they have any option at all. Or maybe who doesn't even know that there's a Catholic charities somewhere that they can recommend them to go to Catholic charities or any other organization. So for me to set aside some time to meet with individuals like that. So that's mainly, it's more than that, but in the section of immigration and immigrant, that's part of what I've been doing.
Okay, wow, it's more than that. That was a lot. That's so much. That's great. Thank you for that. We are coming near the end of my time, so I just want to ask one last question and see if you guys each are willing to weigh in on it. Just how would you recommend our community, people who are listening now, who might be listening later, stay informed and engaged on this issue? People who want to do something, make a difference, become advocates, donors, volunteers. If there was one or two things you could tell people to do, what would you recommend?
I can start. I'm sure we all would. There's a lot to do there, but I think I'd underscore advocacy is really important right now. It's really a unique time to be weighing in with our elected officials, and that's at the state level. A lot of immigration issues are at the federal level. So I know we've got tools on the World Relief website, worldrelief.org/advocate, that just kind of we'll keep that updated with what we think are some of the most pressing issues. But the immigration policy is changing kind of all the time, or at least efforts to change it all the time. And some of the really hard dynamics, whether it's around unaccompanied children or refugee resettlement or asylum seekers or people who've been undocumented for 20 or 30 years, there's needs to be advocating on all those issues. So I'd highlight that.
Great, thank you.
I would also say that like I said, when I came, I did not know what to do. I thought I knew, and I helped myself, and I failed. So what I would say is, if there were a way of education to educate people, that we have good people out there, attorneys who are pro bono, who can help people at least to understand what to do. So education is key into this, not only for immigrant or those who just arrived, even for citizens to know that immigrant is not a virus, is not a danger in the community. That education is key for each and everyone. And you asked before about the biblical base. In the name of these refugees, and these are three people, it's supposed to be Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. Yeah. Help all other refugees. We aid other refugees. It's what we need to do as children of God, as people who want to, I was listening moments ago to somebody was saying, if there is no diversity, there is no unity. Diversity is there, and unity will be there if we allow diversity. If we don't allow diversity, unity is going to be missing. So that's what I would say: education and support those who are in need, who need to know what to do and where to go.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think also just as people of faith, that, recognizing that we are all created in God's image. We recognize too that people, are on a continuum in their journey of understanding this issue. And so I, like Matt and Jean-Baptiste has recommended, to be educated. I don't think Matt would push this himself, but Matt Sorens and Jenny Yang wrote a really great book called Welcoming the Stranger. And, it really gives that biblical basis of, the why behind this is important of people of faith. So I would definitely recommend that as a resource to share with your churches, to share with your neighbors, to read yourself and your family, because, especially in this highly politicized arena that we've lived in this last year, especially, people really need to ask the Lord, what is, how should I approach this issue? So.
I would just add in quickly, I think advocacy and legislative advocacy is huge, and that would probably be like one of my top. But in addition, I do think giving money makes a big difference. And I think sometimes there is a stigma to, oh, I'm just giving money, as if that's like somehow not enough. Or, but I think that if you're giving to the right places that hire the right people, to the trained people to help, it really does make a big difference.
That's great. Thank you. Emily, do you want to add?
I really don't like to close out because I just agree with everything else that everyone said. And I think, if you are not yourself in a position of needing assistance and you're trying to engage with immigrant communities, be welcoming and also listen, and be very cognizant that people might not be ready to share with you, as Jean-Baptiste so generously did, their experiences with you right away. And it's not your right to have those stories unless they want to share them with you. So be supportive in the way that they want you to be supportive, even if that's not necessarily what you thought that interaction would be. But I totally agree. Advocacy and supporting organizations that are doing good work, especially because we know that the immigrant community has been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, has been disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, and also that many immigrant families have been left out of stimulus, of aid, of all of these other programs, which have not done enough for a lot of people, but many of them have actually been left out completely. So yeah, I just echo everything else that everyone said, and get involved. It's a great time to get involved in this issue. It's never the wrong time to learn and get involved.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that's really important. And we have links to a number of the wonderful organizations represented here over on Facebook. So I'm sure you can navigate your way to a donate button there. And I think we'll try to follow up too with some organizations, Emily alluding to, maybe organizations that are specifically supportive of immigrant communities. I think that would be a great follow up for Boston Faith and Justice. So I will do that and get that out to you all, just to help guide and direct where maybe we can put our dollars, if, those of us that maybe have disposable income, but there's other ways to engage that have been noted here. So it's great, whatever your resources are, they can be used. I think that that's come out loud and clear. So thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I think that you've just highlighted so many different issues. You've educated us, you've inspired us, you've challenged us. And it's just so much. This is what we ask for in these panels, and you've just gone above and beyond. So thank you. Thank you to everyone who's listening now and later. I will just put in a plug for Boston Faith and Justice. Engage with us in our work. This is the kind of stuff we try to do. We try to do it in an ongoing way, in a way that builds community and demonstrates that God's people are meant to be doing justice in the world. So it would be great if you would like to support us as well. So thank you guys once again. Have a great rest of your evening, and so grateful for the work that you do and the time that you took to share it with us. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great.